Now, what kind of models did we build that fed that story? Well, if you look at, I'll just take two, but they were key and central models in the story of the profession. The infinitely lived consumer with perfect foresight, which became a workhorse in macroeconomics, gives no role or no serious, no non-trivial role for policy. The basic theorems of welfare economics and the one consumer economy is that leave markets alone and raise all revenue through lump sum, that's necessary, through lump sum taxes. This is not policy by deduction, really. This is policy by assumption. There is no other, and it's an instant consequence of the assumptions that were made. Bob Solow has underlined this very strongly. I'm not a macroeconomist, but my macroeconomics teacher was Bob Solow. He says, but in my more pessimistic moments, I think that the only reason to insist on optimizing behavior is to get welfare conclusions that no one believes anyway. The most spectacularly implausible being that the observed business cycle is really an optimal adjustment to unexpected shocks to technology. That's Journal of Economic Perspectives 2000. I cannot believe that the events of the last couple of years have led Bob Solow to change his mind. Problem was that when he says that no one believes those welfare conclusions anyway, he wasn't quite right. A number of people appeared to believe those, many people appeared to believe those welfare conclusions. And we cannot, I think, appeal to the empirical justification for that story, implausible or not. And again, quoting from Bob Solow in the American Economic Review papers and proceedings, he says, but in my view, is that this explanation of short-run motions of the economy has been an empirical failure, or at best a non-success. So I don't think we can go the empirical route to justify assumptions which are manifestly implausible, but yet lead to very powerful theoretical implications. We have to use the basic theorems of welfare economics as a springboard. That's what Jim Mirrlees did in his theory of optimum income taxation. That's what Ken Arrow did in his work on the economics of medical care that I've referred to. The second assumption that was predominant in our profession was the efficient markets hypothesis. Again, policy comes out of that by assumption. If you make the efficient market hypothesis, what's the role for policy in correcting markets? Now, there is much more evidential support for the efficient markets hypothesis than there is for the one consumer infinite with perfect foresight and infinite horizons. But that's support for an efficient market hypothesis loosely expressed and some of the time. The point of policy is to cover, indeed much of the point of policy, not the only, but much of the point of the policy in this area is to cover what happens when things go wrong. So in order to assert the retreat from regulation of the kind that Alan Greenspan was describing, you have to assert a very strong form of the efficient markets hypothesis, namely that it doesn't go wrong very often, and when it does, it's not that bad. Because regulation is about, in this area, is about how you deal with cases where it does go wrong and the consequences of going wrong are bad. So the policy side of the efficient markets hypothesis that you need in order to justify retreat is much, much stronger than the simple empirical version of it implying, if you express it loosely enough, some of the time. Now, if I could remind you, and again, Charlie and I didn't coordinate, but I'm going to refer to Charles Mackay. Also, those of you who haven't read Charles Mackay should. It's wonderful stuff. You can tell from the title that you're going to have fun. The title is Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. He published it in 1841. And he goes through over a millennium, the millennium preceding the 19th century. And he says, this is in his chapter on the Crusades, every age has its peculiar folly, some scheme, project, or fantasy into which it plunges, spurred on either by the love of gain, the necessity of excitement, or the mere force of imitation. That was the 19th century. He gives examples of tulipomania in the 17th century, South Sea Bubble in the 18th century. It's tremendous stuff. But let me run forward now to the 21st century and I'll give you a quote from somebody who made a lot of money over the years in the markets, one of the most successful fund managers, and transparency requires, I have to say, is also a donor to the London School of Economics. It's Jeremy Grantham writing in the quarterly letter of his fund, the GMO, in January this year. The incredibly inaccurate efficient market theory was believed in totality by many of our financial leaders and believed in part by almost all. It left our economic and government establishment sitting by confidently, even as a lethally dangerous combination of asset bubbles, lax controls, pernicious incentives, and wickedly complicated instruments led to our current plight. This isn't ex post wisdom. This is somebody who made money from, or at least preserved assets by betting against that prevailing wisdom. And he wrote about it before the bubbles. So if you look at Charles Mackay in the 19th century or Jeremy Grantham now, neither of them economists, I think you'll see a story on the efficient market hypothesis which, looking back, makes it extraordinary that we saw it as a basis for policy. As I say, not difference between basis for policy and empirical description some of the time. I also look back at, and this is very difficult to gather data on, so I have to be tentative here, but we looked at the top 20 social science universities and their economics departments and looked at their courses. Now, the trouble is that when you look at courses online, they're very partial descriptions of what really happens. And so I offer this with some hesitation. But it does seem that in the majority of cases of those top 20, welfare economics or public policy in imperfect economies is an option, both at the graduate level and at the undergraduate level. In many universities, or the top universities in the world, you can go through that cycle of education without actually touching on the basic theory of policy in imperfect markets. There are examples where that's not true, and I draw your attention to London School of Economics, Princeton and MIT as examples where these courses are compulsory, but it's not the majority. So I think what I'm describing is also reflected not only in our models, but in also our education. Now let me mention briefly, because I don't have time to go into it in any detail, compartmentalization or balkanization. And here I'm taking a cue from a past president of the European Economic Association and a close friend, Tony Atkinson. He argued when going to talk to the European Commission in the spring that one of the reasons we failed to anticipate the crisis was that we are divided up now in a way that wasn't true in earlier generations, so that we are less good at seeing the whole. I think, again, referring back to Charlie, we didn't coordinate, I should say, on all this. That was part of Charlie's talk yesterday in looking back at these crises. But if you look at the giants of our profession, many of them strode across it. Keynes, Mead, Samuelson, Friedman, Modigliani, Tobin, Solow, they made important contributions right across. I had the good fortune of talking to all of those except Keynes and Friedman, and you could see it in conversations with all of them, just how easy they found it to link up different bits of the economy, and all of them, I think, were much more reliable on policy, even though they might have had very strong views on policy, which I would not share, and others, would differ with others on that list, but they were capable of talking and thinking about policy in a very striking way.